Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today, I'm continuing my Master Retro reviews by taking a look at Season 4 as a whole. First, let's take a look at each episode of Season 4. There'll be timestamps down below, and then we're going to end off with my concluding thoughts about the season as a whole. So I hope to see you at the end of the video for that, but if you want to jump around the timestamps, you can. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555. And today, I'm continuing my series of Master Retro reviews with the first episode of the 4th season, Welcome to Korea. So, this episode, basically, it's following up after McCain Stevenson's character, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake leaves, and also we find out that Chopper has left as well. So, the episode actually, though, opens up with basically showing what it's like the 477 being under Frank's command. He's a dictator. He's trying to be military, but really it's for him just to be in control. There's literally a scene later on in the episode where he goes to Father McKay and asks him to try to incorporate this into his sermon. Strength through obedience. Frank. You know what you're saying, right? Because that's very similar to something from 1930s Germany. If you know, you know. By the way, also there's this, during the formation at the beginning, Klinger's wearing a hat, and when Frank asks him, why he's wearing that, his response, it's spring, so springtime fall. You know where I'm going here. Yeah, I'm comparing Frank to a certain somebody that I saw earlier in the video, and I don't want to get flagged by YouTube. Because, yay YouTube! But Frank is just an authoritarian dick. That's what he really is. And when they find out that a new surgeon's coming to replace Trapper, Frank and Margaret are like, ooh, we can mold him in our image. Hawkeye gets to him first, of course, because he goes with Raider to pick BJ up in order to try to say goodbye to Trapper, who he misses by 10 minutes. Because Hawkeye was on R&R when Trapper got his orders to leave. And then, of course, he goes through a series of vignettes getting back. So Jeep gets stolen, they go into the officers club. In order to get Raider in there, they put one of BJ's captain bars, creating a corporal captain. They steal a general's Jeep. They get stopped by a checkpoint, do some lying. They rescue a Korean girl who was checking out the field for mines because God knows the father couldn't do it because they needed to make it safe for their ox. They have to change a flat tire and get ambushed by North Korean guerrillas. They end up in helping soldiers who are being hit by artillery barrage. And that's also where BJ gets his first true taste of basically military life in the field in combat. Because BJ, fresh out of residency, he even calls his training indoctrination, which already tells you who he's going to be as a character. Very well simpatico with Hawkeye. And then eventually they do arrive at the 477, but they go to Rosie's bar first for a drink. Of course they do. And Hawkeye is totally unfazed by a bar fight going on in the background, and only acknowledges them when they actually break the table that they're at. And then they arrive back at camp. BJ calls Frank ferret face, and then the episode ends with the MPs coming and arresting Frank for, having a general's Jeep, because of the lie that Hawkeye told them earlier. And by the way, Hawkeye had already lied to the MPs after blowing through a checkpoint on the way to get to the air base to try to say goodbye to Trapper. He already had done that as well. But this is only a theory on my hand, but after all this is when they introduce all the cast, the main characters, which they've done really at the end of the first episode of each season. And by the way, in this episode, Jamie Farr, Corporal Killing, is elevated to main character status. But, of course, they end with announcing that Colonel Parker is going to be coming. Could the thing with the Jeep be why Colonel Parker from an in-universe perspective, the decision was made to send him to take command of the Union because Frank couldn't be trusted because he stole a general's Jeep? I'm just saying. It's a theory. I like it. And I think it would be quite an interesting thing if that was the case. The real reason is they actually did want to have somebody replace Henry and they decided to go for a different kind of character, but I like my in-universe theory a lot. So overall, this is a great fun episode, a great reintroduction, and I also think it sets the tone for what Season 4 and MASH is becoming. Because we do have our comedic moments, but the scene where they're helping those injured soldiers, and there comes a moment where it just gets to BJ. This is probably the most amount of blood and guts he has seen, and he has to just take a moment and at the very least dry heave. I don't know if he actually throws up. And Hawkeye just takes a moment and comforts him before getting right back at it. But that scene alone is setting that tone that, hey, things are going to start getting more serious. That was a scene not played for laughs, it was played seriously. And as something that is just a nature of being in a war environment. Even some of the other scenes that they also played for comedy, such as with when they were changing the flat tires and ambushed by guerrillas. The only part that was really played for comedy there was Radar trying to get the jack for the Jeep put back in, and Hawkeye tells him to leave it. Radar says, "It's a generous jack, sir," and says, "Salute and leave it." And that's like the only humor, but the rest of the situation was treated seriously. And kind of same thing with the Korean family having their daughters check a minefield for mine. Oh, a field for mines, not a minefield for mines. The only thing that was really played up for laughs was more the communication barrier. Everything else about it was treated seriously, and maybe not super seriously, mind you, but it does show the direction that MASH is going in terms of its humor. There's still going to be humor involved, but you can already tell they're saying, letting us, the audience, know through these vignettes that, hey, we're going to start being a little more serious about things. And that really does come to fruition in the very next episode, Change of Command with Colonel Potter, but we're going to be talking about that next week. But in the meantime, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger, I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 3, Change of Command. Now, I do want to address that Change of Command is the third episode because the first episode, Welcome to Korea, is a two-parter. Even though I reviewed and watched it as only one episode, it still counts as two episodes, making this the third episode of Season 4 and the 75th episode overall. But let's actually talk about the episode. This is when Colonel Potter takes command. It actually opens up with seeing a little bit more of Frank's command style. Very authoritarian. He's talking about putting enlisted men in their place. You know what he's doing there. And Radar gets the mail, but he doesn't go to Frank immediately like Frank wants. He goes to distribute the mail because in there is a letter from command in order informing them that they're getting a new commanding officer. And Frank does initially hold himself together when he hears the news in the mess tent. And then he breaks down having a temper tantrum when he goes into Margaret's tent. And then he goes AWOL while Colonel Potter arrives. Colonel Potter, is regular army, so I should address that because when they first, mainly BJ and Hawkeye, hear that they're getting a new CEO, Frank is being replaced, they're happy until they see that that Potter has USA, which is United States Army, which means regular army after his name, not a draftee. So yeah, so they're not so happy about that. But by the end of the episode, they're fine because one, we learn about who Potter is, which makes sense. This is the introduction, so we're gonna have to learn. We learn that he joined the army during World War I by lying about his age. Eventually, became an officer. So he was originally enlisted. That he had a still at one point during World War II and all that. So it's like, yes, he's regular army and all that, but at the same time, you can definitely, they show that he may be regular army, but he's not a jerk about it. And I think that's a great way of describing it. Frank is a jerk about it, and he's not regular army. He's a draftee or a reservist, depending on if you were talking about the movie or not. But the point being is they're showing that Colonel Potter may definitely be more formal in terms of military, but he also can come to understand that, okay, certain things can't always be done the military way. Like, he's perfectly fine with Hawkeye and BJ having a still. He drinks with them and seeing them about. And he agrees also to let Klingo continue to wear his dresses. Because while there's other episodes where Klingo is wearing the proper uniform, including Welcome to Korea where he's just wearing a hat, in this episode it's established that if he's wearing the full uniform, he basically mentally gets a hive, gets an itch. And because Hawkeye rightfully identifies his civilian clothes, be it regular civilian clothes for a man back in the 1950s, or just the female clothes he wears to get out of the army, is his defense against the system. Very astute, and with how Klingo has typically been portrayed. And Hawkeye gives Klingo the advice that to wear a slip under his uniform, and he does. Only half a slip because that's his best slip. Which is kind of fun, like, he took the best slip literally instead of wearing a full one. But at the end of the episode, they talk Potter into letting Klingo wear dresses. And the thing is, doesn't matter too much, Klingo gets his jobs done, so let him wear whatever he wants. Especially if it prevents him from, not being itchy, not having a rash, which actually interferes with his duties, unlike his whatever he wants to wear. I'm just saying. But overall, this is a good episode, a good introduction to Kuna Potter. We learn, of course, more about him in future episodes. But, like any establishing episode, especially introducing a new character, we need to learn who that character is. It's kind of similar how in the previous episode, we learned who BJ is as well. Also, there's this great scene as well where Conan Potter is basically talking with the officers, which, by the way, is only Margaret, Father McKay, Hawkeye, and BJ, because Frank went AWOL. All the nurses are technically officers, so shouldn't they be there? And I'm sure there's a few other officers as well in camp. I'm just saying, but it's just our main character officers. And there's a scene where after going over Margaret's record, Potter says, Major Frank Burns, and Margaret responds, just friends, so. It's kind of funny because if you know the context. I wonder if Potter picked it up. I'm sure he's seen a few things being in the military for so long. But overall, this is a good episode. I think, like I said, it sets up things very well, reintroduces us to our established characters in this new dynamic. And overall, I think it does a good job for getting us fully ready for season 4 of MASH. But that's where I'm going to leave my review. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with season 3, episode 4. It happened one night. So, like I said, this is the 4th episode of the season. This is the 4th episode of the 4th season of MASH. It's also the first episode where there's no reference made to Henry Blake. After all, he did leave at the end of season 3, but the first 2, 3 episodes did at least make mention of his character, and they will mention him again, but this is the first one where he does not appear at all, and they don't mention him. But it's nighttime at the 477, and, well, it's pretty uneventful, at least according to Frank, for his shift in post-op. Yeah, Margaret and Hawkeye are not as lucky. They have one patient who has extremely low blood pressure and is not doing well. And BJ ends up operating on him again, and that seems to have fixed it. And that's essentially how the episode ends, so it actually ends with a bit later. I'll get to that moment in a second. But there's also one patient in post-op who is being quite unruly, and eventually they have to sedate him because, yeah. But that's not all that's going on. Radar wakes up Kuna Potter to try to get the artillery people to stop shuttling so close to the camp because it's disturbing the patients. Frank is looking for all of the love notes he wrote to Margaret to destroy, because that's what he does with the ones he receives from Margaret. And that's actually how the episode ends, when Margaret comes back into her tent and there's Frank passed out because he couldn't find them. He claims he was just searching for a pencil. Margaret, you can do better. You actually will do better. Not that much better, but you will do better, and you can't do better than Frank. Klingo's also trying to, find a new way of getting out of the army. Going outside and it's cold and nothing. Doesn't really work. He ends up going into post-op to warm up. But he does volunteer to be tapped as a blood donor so that way BJ's patient could have some more blood ready for when they, actually operate on him. Again, it's a small, short episode, but no, it's quite fun. We get some good character moments. We get, I think some really good moments between Hawkeye and Margaret. Like, there's a scene near the end where a bunch of beans kids spilled on them. It's like, it's just a fun little scene there. Like, way more chemistry between them than between Margaret and Frank. And yes, I mean chemistry in that way. While they never really act on it, though there's one episode where two episodes I believe later on where they do talk about that as a possibility. But like, both of them know that it would never work out despite their chemistry because their lives are so different. They're so different people. But it is quite impressive, the chemistry. And I think that also is evident to some pretty good behind-the-scenes chemistry where the actors are able to work well and play off of each other very well. And that's what helps getting good characters, if the actors can play off of each other really, really well. That's pretty much all I have to say. Is there more I can talk about? Sure. But you know what? We're going to leave that for the comment section down below. I would love to hear your thoughts down there. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm reviewing the 5th episode of the 4th season of MASH. The episode is The Late Captain Pierce, so obviously I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews. And in this episode, Hawkeye is dead, but not really. The army only thinks he is dead, and shenanigans ensue. Well, ensure as well, I guess, when you think about it. But essentially, some paperwork mishap, and the army thinks Hawkeye is dead, and Hawkeye's father also thinks he's dead now, and calls Captain Honeycutt BJ because, yeah, why not? Who else is going to call Hawkeye? He thinks Hawkeye's dead. And basically the episode, it's not like other episodes that actually deal with the concept of death in a much more dramatic sense. I know there's 2 episodes that actually do that more in later seasons. One is when there's that dead soldier and only Klinger could see him. And then there's that when Charles is almost shot during a sniper attack. But we got a couple of seasons to go before we get to those points. But in this episode, it's all basically played for laughs. The seriousness is the fact that Hawkeye is basically cut out of the army system. He can't get his pay. His father thinks he's dead. That's where the seriousness comes in. And it's just overall a fun episode. You have the person from who's sent to pick him up, whose nickname is Digger. How morbid. And all that. They hold a fake wake / funeral for Hawkeye, all that. But probably the biggest thing in this episode is there's 2 scenes. One is where Hawkeye's trying to get his pay, but he can't because he's legally dead according to the army. He also can't get his mail, but because he can't get his pay, he attacks Frank. In real life, yeah, that probably would get him court-martialed, but here's my thing. They can't court-martial him if they think he's dead. I'm just saying. Also, too, with that scene as well, Frank was kind of asking for it, kind of laughing at Hawkeye over the whole situation. So he kind of was asking for Hawkeye's little bit of an angle there. But there's also a more serious moment where basically Hawkeye thinks back to, that Trapper left and the war continued, that Henry was killed and the war continued, and that's kind of where the seriousness. And then Hawkeye decides, no, he's going to get off the bus with all the other corpses, and he's going to go back to work. Because, he is a doctor and the wounded need treating. And that's pretty much how the episode ends, except for a scene where he finally gets to talk to his father and telling him he's still alive. And basically says he needed a new set of golf clubs anyhow, and asks his father to send him his allowance again. Which I think is just a good, fun way of ending the episode. Again, while it does deal with a pretty heavy concept, they play mostly for laughs because MASH is getting more serious, but it's still generally a sitcom, if you will. It's still generally, a comedy first and drama is going to be secondary, but you can tell things are getting a little more serious in terms of the stories that they want to tell. Plus, they also bring back the same character, not the same character, the same actor, Armand Quick, to play Captain Pratt. He also played a previous character known as Captain Sloan, and their personalities are like the same. Except for Pratt actually does do a little joking, now that you can tell. But again, it's just overall, I think, a fun, basic episode, nothing too interesting about it, just standard MASH stuff, if you will. But that's what I got to say. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with the 6th episode of Season 4. The episode is called Hey Doc. So, there's basically several plots going on in this episode. Basically, there is a sergeant who's planning to leave home, but he wants to start a Korean restaurant, and he has a lot of stuff with him, so he can't fly home. He needs to take a ship. Hawkeye and BJ are like, yeah, sure, whatever. But they need a third doctor signature, and that's going to have to be Frank, because, a medical illness is preventing him from flying. But during this as well, there are snipers coming into the camp, so that's causing problems. And 2 people arrive, and they both have an impact on the plot regarding the snipers. But also, we get to see some off-the-book medicine. So first, a British patrol arrives to try to chase the sniper off. And the lieutenant has an ingrown toenail that he needs taken care of on the down low, because if his command finds out about it, he could be denied a promotion or leave. Because apparently that's a big problem in the British Army, I guess. But anyhow, so they treat his toenail, and in exchange he'll get them 2 bottles of high-end scotch, which they do receive, and then the sniper destroys them. So Hawkeye and BJ are like, okay, something needs to be done. And so earlier in the episode, a colonel from the 1st Cavalry Division arrives and to visit one of his men. Really, he arrives because he got a little close to a local individual who had some VD, if I understood the language correctly, because he kept it, he didn't want it to get out after all, so he doesn't really say what it is, but I pieced the pieces together, so. And so Hawkeye treats him on the down low, just gives him a shot of penicillin, but later during the sniper attack, Hawkeye rings him up. It's like, hey, so you said you want a favor. Sounds like he then, based on the one-sided phone conversation, he wasn't going to give a favor in return. But Hawkeye say, well, because of the sniper attack, I might have to move my private records into the official records. And then all of a sudden, the tank shows up. And they're only for 24 hours. But when Hawkeye says that the records were destroyed, the colonel is like, you know what? You can have it for a week. And then, of course, I should also mention, too, during all this, that when the colonel first arrives to visit the camp, Margaret is definitely takes an interest in him, and Frank is jealous of. So what does Frank do? He gets into the tank because he wants to show off to Margaret. And then he panics and runs over a couple tents and also a jeep, which Colonel Potter then shoots the jeep, not Frank. No matter probably how much Hawkeye wanted the other way around, it was a jeep. But basically, remember, Colonel Potter is an old cavalryman, and if a horse was injured in the field of battle, the horse was often put out of its misery by shooting it. And so Colonel Potter did the exact same to a jeep, which is funny. But apparently there is an old World War II cartoon drawing that depicts a cavalry officer doing the same thing as well. And then BJ and Hawkeye get Frank to sign the Sergeant Kimball, that's the sergeant's, by the way, discharge forms to allow him to go home on a ship, basically by saying like you were only trying to stop the tank rather than being dumb. Colonel Potter saw right through it, by the way. Overall, this is a fun episode. The wiki for MASH actually describes this episode in the summary as another for Rich Day, so basically whoever wrote the wiki article for this episode is calling back to the episode of For Rich Day. And yeah, this episode does kind of have some similarities to that episode in terms of plot structure structure with more vignettes going on, and the things are all loosely connected. But I would say this one's actually more connected. There is a through line between most of the different plot points. The only plot point that doesn't really connect is the scene between Radar and Klinger, which I'm like, okay, how does that relate to the rest of the stuff? And what were they actually doing? Were they actually preparing for a talent show? I'm honestly not sure. I don't think the episode, no, I think they just wanted a fun Klinger bit and they threw it together, and it doesn't really connect with the rest of the episode in any way. But that's not mean it's a bad thing. It just means it's an out of place scene that makes you laugh because it doesn't connect at all with anything else going on. But overall, like I said, it's a fun episode. Now, the wiki does make note that there is some uniform inconsistencies, but this is MASH. Inconsistencies is a thing. MASH doesn't really care about continuity, really. Yes, as it goes on, continuity becomes a little bit better, but it's mostly character development continuity, which is honestly the most important part. And as long as each episode is internally coherent, in a sitcom, that's all you need. You don't need big story arc, character, or continuity development between events and timeline. That's not what MASH is, and we shouldn't be applying to MASH the same rigor continuity we apply to modern day serial stories. And also, yes, I studied history. I love history. I would love if maybe the uniforms were a bit more historically accurate. But again, MASH is not that kind of show, so I can give it a bit more of a pause. It's kind of the same thing like with the historical inaccuracy in Hogan's Heroes. Yes, it's historically inaccurate. It's not at all something that would have happened. And MASH is actually better for historical accuracy than Hogan's Heroes. But that doesn't mean it ain't fun. And these kinds of shows, that's what they're there for. They're all for fun. Could they have done a more serial, historically authentic story and still have it fun? Yeah. But that's not what MASH is. MASH is just a fun show. And it is fun, and I love it. And really, I just love how we get more episodes that are fun but still deal with something. This episode doesn't deal with anything too much, but you have that plot line of two people who get off the record medical help because basically they either made a mistake or were dealing with something else, and something slipped by them. That probably happens a lot in the military, things that the soldiers do that they don't want on the record. And probably is also more realistic of war. Like, soldiers are not going to be perfect all the time, guys. Remember that. But that's what I got to say. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBay555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 7, The Bus. So, to begin with, I think this is actually probably overall one of my favorite episodes in Season 4 of MASH. It's a pretty simple episode. Hawkeye, BJ, Kunapata, and Frank, along with Radar, are coming back from a medical conference on the bus, and it breaks down. It's a pretty simple premise, but I think it's a really good episode. It has some good character moments between pretty much almost every single character. We see Frank being his normal self. We see just, the friendship between Hawkeye and BJ. We see Kunapata being a level-head commander, which Frank would not have been. We see Radar being himself. And we also get a surrendering North Korean soldier. Like, again, it's a pretty basic episode. It's very much a barter episode because they just needed a country road, a place to park, the bus, and 5 of the actors, and that's it. This is practically a barter episode. Not much was needed, and I think it produced a really great episode because the limiting premise of it, I think, really allowed almost to give each character a little bit of a spotlight scene. Especially the ending, especially like the different ways each character treated the North Korean soldier who surrendered. Frank is all like, if you do something, I'm going to get you. Hawkeye and BJ is like, yep, whatever. You're good. Okay, yep, we treated your injury. Good, we're going to treat you like a human. Kunapata, well, at the end of the episode when Frank conveniently finds some chocolate bars, I'll talk about that in a moment, even though Frank decides not to give one to the North Korean soldier, Paul to make sure to grab two, so that way the North Korean soldier could get one. And there's also Radar trying basically to run everything. Not really trying, but does remember, he basically does run the 477, especially back in the first 3 seasons. But here, okay, he can't get the bus to work, and he somehow blames himself for that and them getting lost, so he decides to go off on his own and trying to find help. Doesn't work. But when he gets back, that's when he discovers Frank fell asleep on guard duty, keeping an eye on the prisoner, and that he had chocolate bars. So after the North Korean prisoner got the bus started, so thank you to him for that. When Radar is told to make note that they should keep some supplies in the bus, like food and that, he conveniently says, we could just keep a ditty bag with some chocolate bars and not fall asleep on guard duty. And Frank goes, oh, hey, that reminds me. Radar blackmailed Frank. I love that. I think everyone knew Frank fell asleep on guard duty from that. There's also, Frank does at one point in the episode find the 477's walkie-talkie, but there's a problem with it. One, it needs its pail, which is back at the 477, 20 miles away, and it's broken, and apparently when it is working, it only works like a mile or maybe at best. But somehow they do find the other walkie-talkie on the bus, so BJ and Hawkeye decide to play a prank on Frank by getting the North Korean soldier to speak into the walkie-talkie, and Frank's convinced he's now hearing all the enemy's secrets. I do wonder if anyone understands Korean or Chinese, because again, I'm not the best at identifying those languages, and I don't even know if one of those languages was actually being spoken by the North Korean soldier. Tell me what he's saying. Is he actually saying something, or is it gibberish? I want to know, because I don't have an ear for that language, and I can't tell it apart from the other languages in the East Asian area of the world. But again, like I said, it's just a good, fun episode with some good moments. They didn't use the laugh track really at all. Actually, I don't think they used it at all in this episode, and it works. It's so good. You don't need a laugh track. If something's funny, you naturally will generally laugh about it. But I do want to also mention one other thing about this episode. In the Mesh Wiki, in the research notes / fun facts section, mentions that Burns is carrying a German World War II MP40. And then whoever left this goes on to say that U.S. Thompsons and Chinese burp guns were the submachine guns used. One, I think this was taken from the North Korean soldier, and two, I'm confident that the Soviets captured a lot of German MP40s during World War II, and I know, if I remember correctly, there was one German gun they did repurpose for their own use because they liked it. If I remember my history correctly. But it's entirely possible that to help prop up North Korea, they gave them captured German weapons. So, the person's treating like this could never happen, but weapons do move around during war. Weapons are regularly captured, and sometimes they're not used at all because you don't have ammunition there, but sometimes you do. Like, in World War II, after Germany invaded and took over Czechoslovakia, they started manufacturing Czechoslovakian guns to German calibers. That's a historically documented fact. And if I remember correctly, the Germans also basically stole a Soviet gun as well and made their own version of it. So it's not impossible that a German MP40 from World War II would have ended up in North Korea and then captured by Americans. Totally historically believable. Did it happen is a different question, but it is historically possible based off of what we know about history and all that. But that's just the most side point. There's also a scene too. This is just probably one of my favorite scenes in the episode though, is BJ's peeking over the bus window and Hawkeye just writes Kilroy underneath, which was a very popular graffiti left by American soldiers during World War II, and I just loved its inclusion. But those are just my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of Master Retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 8, Deluge. Mildred. So this is another episode writing episode. And in this episode, Colonel Potter is writing an anniversary letter to his wife, Mildred. And so Frank and Margaret are trying to get the perfect anniversary present for him. So basically they commission a bust to be made of Colonel Potter. Now when the bust eventually is revealed, Frank and Margaret is like, that looks nothing like Potter. But Potter, and I do agree, it does look somewhat like Colonel Potter. And I feel like that's probably because whoever was actually tasked with making it did maybe too good of a job in looking at the reference photos. I don't know about that. But also in this episode too, there's a injured horse that the Chinese left behind. So Radar doesn't want to be shot, so he convinces Hawkeye and BJ to help him get it and bring it back to camp for medical treatment. And in order to keep it, Radar decides he's going to give it to Colonel Potter. Remember, Colonel Potter is an old cavalryman. So Radar outdoes Frank and Margaret for an anniversary present. And honestly, it's just, I think, a overall really good episode. Like, yeah. Like, it's, I don't know else how to describe it. It's just a good episode. And this is thus the first appearance of Sophie. Though in this episode, the host is a male, or Sophie is normally described as a male, right? So a female host rather than a Stalin, I think, which is the male hostess. I think. I'm not a host person, so take what I said with a grain of salt there. But also because this is a deal blank episode, a letter episode, we get several vignettes that are, things that Colonel Potter seeing or experiencing or remembers. Such as this one scene, after he has a short conversation with Father McKay, he recalls in the letter an event with his wife when they were watching the film, a film, part of the morale stuff, and the film breaks. So Father McKay and then Nurse O'Connor decided to sing a bit that they're preparing for a show for the orphans. And what's neat about that is, in reality, Nurse O'Connor was played by Barbara Christopher, William Christopher's actual wife, which I think is just so neat that they were able to do that. That's like just a fun little behind the scenes fact there. Like I said, just a great episode overall. There's not too much to say about it, but a big part of it is earlier in the episode, Radar was expressing his nervousness around Colonel Potter. Really the first episode that really properly addresses the change of commands, and that can be shown the fact that Radar has his uniform shirt buttoned all the way up to the top, showing to us his anxiety and all that before he actually expresses that to Hawkeye and BJ. But when he gives the horse to Colonel Potter, he's wearing his uniform like normal, showing that, well, it doesn't really major part of the story, showing that he's become comfortable with Colonel Potter. And perhaps finding, the fact that Radar likes animals, Colonel Potter likes horses, a little bit of connection right there that maybe he hadn't sensed before. Again, I could speculate all we want, but overall it's just a fun, good episode. Nothing major, like I said, but it's these kinds of episodes that you really like in TV shows, because they give you a sense of who the characters are and why we should care about them. And this episode does that perfectly for both Radar and Colonel Potter, more than I would say some of the previous episodes have, especially for Colonel Potter, where we were getting to know who he is. Here we get a chance to care about him. Even though that was a part of some of the other episodes, this one I think really just spotlighted that. But those are just my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 9, The Kids. So, the premise, synopsis of the episode, whatever, is that a nearby orphanage run by the character known as Nurse Cratty. She has appeared in MASH before, though this time played by a different actor. They were getting shelled, so they go to the 477, where the 477 not just, lets them stay there, they also, give all the kids medical checkups. And there's also one of the teenage girls there is pregnant, so apparently is on good relations with her in-laws. Again, don't quite get the whole situation because they're just trying to have a plot point so that way they can deliver a baby by cesarean, and they have BJ do it because he's the closest to being out of residency and most likely to have done it. With that then addressed, there's one other thing, big part of this episode, is at the end, they give a Purple Heart to the kid that was born, which was Frank's, which he got because of eggshell fragments. Though, apparently the report just said shell fragments. This is the second time Frank has gotten a dubious Purple Heart, and every single time they make sure to give it away to somewhere else. Yeah, Frank, if you want a Purple Heart, maybe go volunteer at a Battalion 8 station so you can get some real shell fragments. Which actually BJ kind of alludes to when he says we can only hope, or something along those lines near the end of the episode. I also want to address that in this episode, they show that BJ does not know who Nosferatu is, because makes sense, he wasn't in that episode, Trapper was. But apparently, Colonel Potter, even though he replaced Frank, knows who Nosferatu is. Maybe they talked on the phone or something at least once. I mean, it would make some sense. Or maybe somehow they knew each other from the previous war. I don't know. They don't specify, and they just have BJ be the point of view character for us to introduce those of us who don't remember Nosferatu or would have not seen the previous seasons to her character. But overall in this episode is everyone at the camp except for Frank is welcoming and accepting of the orphans being there. Everyone, like BJ and Hawkeye tell the kids a bedtime story. Hawkeye says about Frank, of course, a bad major. While BJ tells the tale of Androcles and the lion, they fall asleep, and then Hawkeye was like, wants them to finish it. And then, of course, Colonel Potter's telling a story as well. But it's how to field strip an M1 Garand rifle. But he made it sound exciting. And after the kids fall asleep, because it is just a field manual after also actually borrowing, he goes on to continue reading it. And he says Garand, not Garand. No, he says Garand, not Garand. One is how most people pronounced it, and one is how the developer of the rifle pronounced his own last name, which is where the name comes from. Regardless of that pronunciation, doesn't matter. But in all, like I said, everyone is taking care of these kids and all that, but Frank, well, he's convinced that they're stealing from him. And to be fair, one of the boys did con him out of 50 cents, or beat him out of 50 cents, depending how you want to look at it. Beat him is probably how Hawkeye, BJ, and the rest saw it, while con is how Frank saw it. And then, but he's convinced that that kid is going to be stealing. And Father Mulcahy needs to use his experience in boxing to get Frank to scrub up for surgery because they're getting wounded coming in. Frank, you're so distracted. Frank also calls them foreigners. And Hawkeye rightfully points out that they are the foreigners, i.e. Hawkeye, BJ, all our main cast, because they're Americans in a country that's not America, making them foreigners by definition. Frank is racist in this episode. I think that's the easiest way to describe it. He's relying on stereotypes, so at the very least he's prejudiced, and all that. We could go on and on about Frank's just lack of empathy, and that's really who Frank really is as a character, a very self-centered character who really lacks empathy for anyone who isn't like him in some form. And that's essentially what it is. Though there's a few other good things in this episode too, such as there's a scene where there's one of the Koreans basically keeps on calling Klingo. Did I write it down? No, I did not. Mama say or something like that. Again, just to cute this there. There's another one Korean girl. She's a piano prodigy and is playing really good music. And even though when Klingo goes to put her back to bed, she wakes up and goes to continue playing, which I'm sure all the other kids probably loved having piano music. I like having music when I'm going to sleep. I'm just saying. Again, there's more small things here and there. But overall, this is just a good episode. Heartwarming and all that. And really shows the humanity in every character except Frank. And that's actually why in a couple seasons, Larry Linville will leave, because he felt like there was nothing else to do with Frank. There's no way to redeem him as a character, and the bit was just stale. And yeah, and it makes sense. And this episode kind of shows it, like, yeah, you can only do so much with Frank being a prejudicial doofus. There's only so much you can do with that. It gets, like I said, boring after a while, and that's why we got a different character, and a very different character when Charles came on board. But we got a couple seasons to go before that, so let me know your thoughts on the kids in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of Master Retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 10, Quo Vadis Captain Chandler. So, there's some Latin in this title, so I hope I got it correct. But anyhow, the premise of this episode is that casualties come in, and one of the casualties is a captain who believes himself to be Jesus Christ. Frank and Margaret think he's faking it, so they bring Flag in to expose him. Meanwhile, Hawkeye has a brilliant idea. Hey, let's get an actual psychiatrist here who understands the mind and can actually understand what's going on. So he gets Friedman to come. And so Sidney Freeman basically does conclude that the Air Force captain, who from Flag we learn is actually Captain Chandler, has come to believe himself to be Jesus Christ. Not because he's actually Jesus Christ, but because basically dropping bombs, killing a bunch of people who did him no direct harm, caused him to have a mental breakdown, and the way he dealt with that was by, I'm not a killer, I'm Jesus Christ. No, his compassion took over. And Sidney's medical opinion at the end is that while they may be able to help him become Captain Chandler, or just himself again, he should never be returned to combat. And this episode actually does not feature a laugh track, which I think is really good because it does touch on a pretty thing. PTSD is ultimately what's going on in this episode. Captain Chandler's, basically killing people was traumatic, and eventually he snapped and decided he's not going to kill anymore, and in his condition, in his mental breakdown, concluded that if he's not going to kill anymore, he must be Jesus Christ. There's a couple things to also note. He has a pretty good theological foundation too, because one of the questions that Sidney asks him was basically, does God answer all prayers? And Chandler responds, yes, but sometimes the answer is no, which is a very good thing that a lot of people do forget. Sometimes you may get a negative answer. If you are someone who does believe, I should put that qualification in. Again, also too, that's also, I think, a good example, good thing to add, because that implies that Chandler, before he had his breakdown, made a prayer where he maybe, asked something, and it basically asked for the war to end, or asked for him to be able to stop bombing, and because a tear did come down his chin at the time, his cheek, I should say, not chin. And while that zone there, I think, provides some that Chandler had a pretty good theological understanding of his Christian faith, it also reveals that very likely part of his breakdown may have involved him not getting an answer to his prayer that would have perhaps helped him deal in a less drastic way with the trauma he experienced by killing so many people that did him no harm. Though I gotta say, there's some parts of this episode that makes me think that they had thought this episode might have been done when Frank was still here, namely because Margaret, this is the only time she ever goes over Colonel Parto's head for something she did all the time with Henry, so it makes me think part of this episode was retooled, but not every part of it. Again, could be several different things, as well with that. But like I said, this is a really good episode. I like how they didn't have a laugh track. How, yes, while Flag does provide the comedic moments in this episode, they never, the core of it, everything with Captain Chandler, him believing himself to be Jesus Christ, they took seriously, and I don't believe they went into any disrespect in that topic. And also, too, this episode reveals Radar's actual first name, Walter. This is the first time that is ever revealed on screen. And I think it's kind of fitting that that is the way they do that. Basically, Chandler is leaving and Radar asks him to bless his teddy bear. The first time I watched it, I thought that was the name of Radar's teddy bear. I gotta be honest. But his birth name is not Radar, it's Walter. Or should we even say his Christian name that he was baptized with. And also too, that scene also is supposed to show to us the audience as a way to confirm that Chandler just believed himself to be Jesus Christ, not actually Jesus Christ. Because, for one, if he was Jesus Christ, he would have known Radar's real first name of being Walter. But at the same time, I feel like Jesus would be respecting people's choice to be called by what they prefer. So, could go either way on that. But in the context of when this episode was made, the idea that Radar's real name, he did not know, is showing to us that this Chandler just believes himself, confirming Sydney's diagnosis. But also too, Jesus Christ, he would have probably introduced himself as, assuming if you believe Jesus Christ is God and thus knows all and all that, he would be able to speak in any language, so we're going to ignore that part. But also, Jesus would probably introduce himself as Jesus, son of Joseph, or Jesus of Nazareth. So that's probably how he would actually introduce himself, because that's how that stuff worked back then, and would make a lot more sense, because Christ comes from the Greek variation of the Hebrew word Messiah, a title, and for a name, that would be not really given. I could have, maybe Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus son of Joseph, the Messiah, the Christ. Yeah, that could have been done. I think, if I remember my Bible correctly, a few times I think he might have mentioned something along that line. But again, I'm relying on memory there, and I did not do my research like I probably should have. But all this to say, I think this episode not only is really good, but handles the different topics they bring up in a very respectful way. And really, the only time they do a joke is with Klinger at the end, where he dresses up as Moses and hopes to get discharged from the army that way. And again, that was a good way of ending the joke, because it's Klinger, we can do the joke, and it's understandable that it is a joke, a bit of comedy for us. But the rest of it, outside of some of the stuff for Flag, is taken seriously, which, like I said earlier, and I'll say again in my conclusion, I really liked. But those are just my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jolly Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of Master Retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 11, Dear Peggy. Before I get into this episode, I would like to address that this episode has often also been titled Dear Peg. In fact, this episode and The Late Captain Pierce are some of the few episodes where Captain Honeycutt's wife, Peg, is referred to as Peggy rather than Peg. Going forward, it seems like they mostly refer to her as Peg. Now, the episode has BJ writing a letter home to his wife, and Father McKay is visited by a chaplain who's higher up in the chain of command. And despite this being one of those character writes home to a friend, family member, whatnot, the thing is that this is a Father McKay episode. BJ's letter is just a framing device for the episode, and it's kind of disconnected from the rest of the episode. So, in short, there actually are two main plot points. I mentioned the Father McKay being visited by a chaplain from high up in the chain of command, who's basically regular army, and I think there was a scene where Hawkeye says that that Hollister, I think, was the chaplain's name. Colonel Hollister was basically thinks God's like regular army or something, and yeah, including Hollister basically bullies, for lack of a better term, Father Novocaine into writing a letter home to the family of one of the patients, telling them that their son is all right, and then right after it's sent out, that soldier has to go back into surgery, and that surgery. That character, I should say, was originally Frank's patient, who he did a poor job of. BJ saved by basically using stuff he learned in his residency, and then Hawkeye goes and removes the fragments that Frank missed. Basically, Frank is a terrible doctor. Like, literally. Like, yes, missing stuff can happen, but the thing is, like, I don't remember if this happened with Hawkeye, but I know there's an episode with Colonel Parto where he missed a fragment and Hawkeye had to go back in. And for Colonel Parto, that was like, it nearly broke him. He had guilt. It frustrated him, made him consider an early retirement. And I think there might have been an episode already with Hawkeye where he made a mistake and it racks at him. I could be totally wrong about that. But Frank's like, oh well. And that's honestly just terrible characterization, which is great at the same time. Frank is a terrible character, but he's a character that we love to hate. So those moments where they show what those terrible characterizations are good because they show us why he's a bad character. But overall, I enjoy this episode, and it shows really how most of the Arrow characters have that compassionate side. And Frank and Colonel Hollister are being shown almost to be like the non-compassionate, the people who are just, they think they know what they got going, and so be it, wherever it is, and then not prepare for changes. Like Father Novocaine, he states in the episode the reason why he doesn't write letters home to a soldier's family right away is, God forbid, what if the patient does not survive, and he doesn't want to give false hope. And yes, you could definitely make an argument about have faith that these patients will heal, but at the same time, it's also like, it's okay to be like, we're going to wait till we're sure the patient is healed and recovered and stable before we send any letters, just in case the unthinkable happens. Which is a perfectly reasonable opinion. But alas, for lack of better term, the antagonizing forces of this episode are not of that mindset. There's more I could talk about too. There's a subplot with Klinger. It starts him with recounting a dream he had, basically that says that ultimately BJ says that, yeah, it means you want to go home with Margaret. Which Klinger's like, ugh. Granted, I also would say it's a dream, so things can be weird. But then he makes 3 escape attempts in this episode. He disguises himself as a Korean peasant woman. Colonel Parr figures out easy because of his knuckles, Klinger's hairy knuckles. And then he tries to escape by the river to the sea and uses a self-inflatable raft cart. And then he disguises himself as a tree, which honestly might have been his most successful attempt, if not for a dog that urinated on him. Honestly, that was a great way of ending the episode. And Klinger, through his different things that he does to get out of the army, taking things to the highest degree of absurdity, is a great way of keeping that humor while allowing the main events of the episodes to be a bit more seriously taken. In this episode and the previous episode both do that, in my opinion. But that's what I got to say. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of reviews of MASH Season 4 with Episode 12 of Moose and Men. So, this is, like I said, the 12th episode, and it does certainly actually call back to an earlier episode in Season 1, I believe, with the moose. More than just the concept of a moose existing, no real actual callback. But I bring that up to say they do kind of handle it differently, because in that episode, the moose relationship was treated very differently, much more abusive, if you will, while here is treated more like, there's just having a fling in Korea. Nothing, the only harmfulness is basically his double standard about his relationship with his wife. For context, BJ is talking to Zero in the mess tent and learns that Zero's wife cheated on him and helps him write a letter, and then he finds out that Zero is seeing a local Korean behind his wife's back. Not BJ's wife's back, Zero's wife's back. Though technically he is kind of also behind BJ's wife's back because they're not friends at all. See, I don't know where I'm going with that. So that's that part of the story. Pretty straightforward. But then there's another part of the story. There's Frank basically being paranoid that every local Korean is an infiltrator out to destroy the camp. And so you get the normal hijinks from that. But also there's a colonel that was manning a military checkpoint that gets hit by some grenade fragments. And he does not want Hawkeye to operate on him because he does not like Hawkeye's basically goof-off attitude and all that. And Colonel Potter basically convinces him, hey, he's the best doctor we have here. He does a good job, and just let him be himself. Don't report him. And as a favor to Colonel Potter, that Colonel is like, fine. Essentially, again, it's a pretty basic episode. Nothing too major going on, except for Frank being a major paranoid person. Yeah, like there's one scene actually where he's inspecting, in air quotes, the local Koreans that work in the camp, and Raider's like, yeah, don't listen to him. Yeah, what we've been doing, just continue doing that. Behind Frank's back, of course. And the episode ends with Frank's paranoia being the punchline. First, he thinks Koreans bearing a part of kimchi is a bomb. It's not, it's kimchi. And then, at the very end, the last ending gag, Hawkeye and BJ have grabbed some surgical gloves, blown them up, put air in them, and then popped them to freak Frank out. And they end with and then Frank pulls out basically a lighter that looks like a gun, and they call him the fastest lighter in the West. They're not in the West. They're in South Korea. That's South, not West. There's no such thing as West Korea. I'm sorry, I just had to do that as a joke of my own. Though actually, technically, they're in the area of the world that we generally call East Asia. So, shouldn't it be fastest lighter in the East then? As well? Just some food for thought. But anyhow, those are just... Oh, by the way, Frank bought that lighter from one of the local Koreans that does stuff in the camp. That he was telling, stop peddling goods. Frank, you're being a hypocrite, but that's a Frank thing for you. Anyhow, those are just my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of Master Retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 13, Soldier of the Month. So, there's two things going on in this episode. One, based on the title, there's a Soldier of the Month competition, which is a directive to try to improve morale. And there's also what they decide that they end up calling Korean hemorrhagic fever going around the camp. Frank also gets it, by the way. And based off of actual historical data, what this actually probably is Hentavirus, which actually went around affecting soldiers during the real Korean War. Basically, it makes you not feel well and you can't get too much fluids, otherwise your kidneys will shut down. Yeah, not great. And what's Frank doing? Giving people too much fluids. Go figure. But effectively, common sense, basically. Don't give them too much water, keep them on bed rest, and eventually they get better. And that's what happens. But during all this, Frank ends up writing his will, and he leaves everything to his wife and children, including his cookbooks, because he does not report his actual income to the federal government. Frank is committing tax fraud to get Al Capone. You don't want to mess with the IRS. And then he leaves Margaret all his clothes. Yeah, Margaret's not too happy about that, and once she's sure that he's back to normal, she punches him. Yeah, he needed his comeuppance. Frank also does prescription kickbacks and that, confirms that he's just not a good person altogether. But before he got sick, he was supposed to be the judge for the Soldier of the Month contest. Instead, Hawkeye and BJ end up being the judge for the contest, and the finalists end up being, well, Radar, Klingo, surprisingly, who ships up because he went to R&R in Tokyo for 6 days. Also, Ego and Zero. I think Zero. How far I got, because there's Zero and Rizzo. It's Zero. Rizzo hasn't been introduced yet. Similar characters, believe it or not. But anyhow, that's sidetracked. But the point being is, all the listemen are basically sucking up to try to get the R&R. And Klingo decides he's going to cheat on the test, so he memorizes it. Hawkeye and BJ begin suspecting something and ask him a question that's not even on the test. And he says, it's not on the test. And Hawkeye says, how do you know that? And then Radar sees that Klingo has the answers on him. By the way, Radar ends up winning, goes to Tokyo, and he gets drunk and gets charges against him. And that's not like Radar. That's almost like earlier seasons Radar before he became the naive, perpetual young boy that we kind of know him to be now. It would make sense with earlier Radar characterization, but hey, it also makes a really good ending gag as well that no one expected Radar of anyone to get in trouble during R&R. So it does actually fit with what they want to tell in the episode, but it does kind of clash with some of the earlier continuity. Wait, this is MASH. There's no such thing as continuity. Remember, MASH does not really care about continuity. But like I said, it's a good, fun episode. And part of the reason why Radar wins is because he knew the answers and he wasn't cheating. And so, voila. Like I said, overall, it was a good, fun episode with some good, fun moments. Nothing major, nothing profound, but just good old, I would say probably good old MASH. There's not really another way of describing it. But those are just my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 14, The Gun. So the premise of the episode is that a colonel comes in injured actually, not wounded because it was a American tank that hit their jeep. Not an enemy tank, and it was not combat operations. But anyhow, he has an old Colt Service revolver. In the dialogue, I will say they do describe it as one type of Colt revolver, while the actual prop is a different type. But regardless of that, he comes in and he's a bit obsessed with it, and it goes missing. And Radar's blamed because he's the one in charge of the locker where they keep all the soldiers' guns and that stuff. And he could be facing 15 years if they don't find the gun or find who actually took it. Yeah, not good. So can I say one thing? When Radar was collecting the guns, he talked about it that the colonel would get a receipt at its standard SOP, which I didn't see standard because the S in SOP stands for standard operating practice or procedure. I'm actually surprised they actually threw that jargon in just, I wouldn't have expected MASH to actually say, hey, let's throw in some proper, bureaucratic jargon. But they did. But anyhow, the last person to see the gun was Radar and Frank. Yeah, Frank took the gun, and he tried to say it was his. Yeah, Mark was mad at him by the end of the episode for that, after Frank shoots himself in the foot when he decided to return the gun. There's actually a scene, and this is shortly after the scene where Hawkeye and BJ confront Frank, because they suspect it's Frank, and, well, Frank actually has a valid point. They're assuming Radar's innocent until proven otherwise. Why doesn't he get the same treatment? And, yeah, and then Hawkeye and BJ is like, don't you hate it when he's right? And Frank is right in that regard. But Hawkeye and BJ also right in their suspicions. And by the way, during the Radar actually gets drunk in this episode off of not even a full beer, and he eventually goes to post-op to confront the colonel, and that's when Frank is returned the gun, and the gun goes off. And Radar being there proves that Radar didn't steal the gun. But can I say something? Why is the gun kept loaded? Seriously, why is it kept loaded? That is just bad safety practices. At least I know in the Cold War, like going into certain places, soldiers would have to remove all the ammunition from their guns and then discharge it in a safe manner to make sure it was empty. I do know that did occur on some military installations in the Cold War. So why is the gun kept loaded? Why? Did Frank load it? I don't know. Did it not unload it when it got to the camp? Like, what's going on though? Why was it loaded? Why? Why? Because they wouldn't have been able to do the episode otherwise. And actually, I'm not sure what the standard procedures revolving around guns being carried or being stored back during the Korean War. I don't know what the actual procedures were back then. But still, not a very safe practice to keep it loaded. And that's pretty much the episode, but there's a few other things going on. There's a scene where Radar falls asleep, so Colonel Parker have to make an announcement basically telling him, hey, return the gun, and we won't ask any more questions. Which Frank takes advantage of. But that's besides the point, as Colonel Parker goes to tuck Radar in, bring his blanket up, take his glasses off, his keys off, and all that, and also make sure to grab Radar's teddy bear to put in so that way Radar would have his teddy bear, which is just a sweet little scene. Kind of shows that that I would say almost grandfatherly role that he fulfills with Radar. Slightly different than probably more of the fatherly role that more of the walkover type fatherly role that Henry had filled. Just wanted to throw that out there. And then at the end of the episode, they apparently had switched glasses, which we don't see in the episode, but apparently did happen. And while the Mash Wiki does describe that as a goof, thing is, things can happen off screen. I mean, like the gun, we would assume was unloaded, but it was actually loaded. It could have been loaded off screen by Frank or came in off screen loaded. We don't know. And for things like that, you can say, yep, that's an off screen thing. Now, if it happened in a different manner, then sure, but let's just assume it happened off screen. That's the easiest way. We also didn't see Frank discharge the gun. We didn't see that. No. But we heard it. Also, I love the scene where Margaret asks Father Mulcahy what happened. He said, was that a gunshot? He says, well, I don't know. I don't want you to spread any unfounded rumors, but the scuttlebutt is that a gun was fired. I just love that scene. Like, there's some good comedy moments in here as well. I think it's overall just a good, fun episode. And really, Frank should have gotten in trouble. Conduct unbecoming an officer for one. And the matchmaking mentioned another one. Something about, basically taking property that's not yours. So, stealing. And also, Frank learns the wrong lesson. He learns the lesson that if you steal something, you shouldn't return it. Frank, how about the lesson is, don't steal to begin with. I feel like they're doing this also to, I don't know if they had in mind in the coming seasons where they were going to, fully separate Margaret's character from Frank and have her, meet Donna Penobscot and get married. But this episode certainly helps to show that the distance is forming, because the look that Loretta Swift gives playing Margaret after Frank said that says a lot. Like, I can't believe you just said that. And also, Frank was only grazed. He wasn't actually seriously injured, so it's not like, he was, lightheaded, blood everywhere. Well, yeah, maybe you wouldn't be making the most sound decisions. But no, it's just a graze. Like, no blood, no bleeding, nothing like that. At least on screen, maybe in real life, but it was, literally, Margaret's own dialogue says that it wasn't serious. And yet, Frank's behaviors would only be justified if he was losing a lot of blood and it was a really serious wound. But that's Frank for you. But like I said, good fun episode overall. I enjoyed it, but I would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBurry555, and today I'm continuing my series of Masterette reviews for Season 4, Episode 15, Mail Call Again. So, the premise of the episode is that the camp gets a bunch of letters. It's mail call. Colonel Potter gets a letter from his son, and informs him that Colonel Potter is about to become a grandfather, probably by the time the letter arrives. So, the camp decides to start a betting pool on who's going to correctly guess the baby's birth date, weight, and whether it's a boy or a girl. By the way, Father McKay is the one who gets it correct. And in this episode, actually, when basic question on how he was able to correct, he says, I can't remember exactly, but he said something along the lines, I know it is something about conception. So basically, he did some math, in other words. He knew it was the baby was a week late, then additional 9 months, and boom. That's probably what he did. I don't know. But the thing is, MASH always generally does this. Whenever they kind of have some kind of betting pool of that going on, they always have Father McKay win. That's a very common thing that they do in MASH. But there's other things going on. Hawkeye gets his hometown paper. BJ gets 2 letters from his wife and 1 letter from his dog, which is written by his wife. I just kind of like, does for the letter from the dog, does she just write woof woof bow wow? I wanted to know, and they didn't share what that was. And Margaret gets a package from the States that is some lingerie that Frank had gotten for her. Because Frank gets a letter from his wife. Remember, Frank is cheating on his wife. And he's also stringing Margaret along. And Frank's wife, Louise, has found out about Margaret and wants a divorce. Frank eventually talks to her over the phone and convinces her not to. It's pathetic and also creepy at the same time. There's a lot of patheticness around blah 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 we can go with, but the creepy part is that threatening to hurt himself, actually step out into the wall. Frank, not good, buddy. I don't know why I said that. But yeah, Frank is just all around a scumbag, and that really proves it. Especially, degrades Margaret to try to, appease his wife. And Margaret overhears all this, so she's rightfully mad at him. And throws that lingerie into the trash, which Klingon actually later finds in the trash. But this is actually probably the maddest that we've seen Margaret at Frank so ever in MASH, I would say. Probably the maddest. And it does kind of help to build up how we'll know later on that she'll actually break it off with Frank. And actually we'll realize that there's no chance of anything, an actual relationship with Frank. Frank is just stringing her along. But we got a bit to go for that. But overall, like I said, it's a pretty enjoyable episode. We get to laugh at the disgustingness that is Frank. We get some good other character moments. We actually get to see a home film from Radar, so we get to see his family. And by the way, his mother is played by Gary Burghoff. So Gary Burghoff, who plays Radar's mother. It's just amazing that they did that. Like, I'm actually kind of surprised that they went with that route, but they really wanted to show the family resemblance. Like I said, overall, it's a good, fun episode. Not too much more to say besides it's helping lay more the groundwork for what we will know that's coming, where Margaret breaks off, stops seeing Frank, and then gets engaged to Colonel Robert Penobscot. But we got a bit to go for that. Let me know your thoughts on this episode in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with my review of Season 4, Episode 16, The Price of Tomato Juice. So the premise of this episode is that the 477 accidentally gets a can of tomato juice delivered to them. Colonel Potter notes how he loves it, so Radar decides that he's going to try to get tomato juice more regularly so that way Colonel Potter can have some. So it's a whole deal of, I do this for you, you do this for me, because they need to get Frank to agree to sign the requisition form, because he's the requisition officer. And he apparently orders all that stuff. And he's not agreeable. But if Hawkeye and BJ can get him a pair of stockings to give to a certain someone, it's Margaret, then he'll sign the requisition for the tomato juice. To get the stockings, they ask if they could buy Klingos. Klingos is like, give me a 2-day pass to Seoul. And that's a little harder because it's not like Colonel Blake, who is easy to trick. Much harder to trick Colonel Potter. Now, what Radar does do is try to do what he would have done with Colonel Blake and just slip it in among some other forms. But Colonel Potter actually reads it and is going to decline it because there was orders to limit 2-day or any kind of passes to Seoul because of a bunch of congressional bigwigs are in town campaigning for re-election. Because they want to show they support the troops, I guess, or something like that. I don't know. But anyhow, also too, he's also saying declining because Klinger apparently has already gone AWOL multiple times that month and all that. Radar lays it in a little bit, and Klingo's depressed, he needs to get away, all that, mentally recover kind of thing. And so, Colonel Potter calls a friend of his, the general who issues the orders, General Barker, and convinces him. And apparently we learned that General Barker also used to do insane stuff during World War II. Putting on the enemy's uniform to go into town? That is a bit weird. A bit weird. But anyhow, that is worked out. But the general wants Margaret to come for a party that he's hosting because of the dignitaries in town. And because of that, she's not taking Frank with her, obviously. And Frank is mad and he won't sign the requisition. So, what do? They write a fake note to Margaret to make her think that Frank is proposing to her, mind you, so that way she stays in camp. And then she sends a note back to Frank, and during Frank's euphoria is when they get Frank to sign the requisition. So I think Klingo not only got to go to Tokyo, because he still goes to Tokyo pretending to be Margaret initially with the general's rival, but I think he also gets to keep his stockings. And it turns out he had a great time with General Barker, who kept Klingo safe from a congressional aide, I think, or congressman who's getting a bit handsy. Also, I think General Barker might be bi, because he asks Colonel Parto when they were on the phone if Klingo was cute, and so I think General Barker might be bi. Ultimately, they get the tomato juice, and Colonel Parto can't touch it because he forgot he's allergic to it. He loves it, but it don't love him. And honestly, I think that's actually a really good thing to include. Yes, it backfires, but it doesn't backfire because one part of the deal fell through. Yes, it nearly did, kind of like in the episode For Want of a Boot, back in, I forget what season that was, but instead of it falling apart because somebody reneged on part of the deal or part of the deal couldn't work out, it's because Colonel Parto forgot he was allergic. Still shows that, basically, except for Frank, everyone basically upheld her end of the bargain, for lack of a better term. But ultimately, I think what also tells us, the audience, I don't know if it was intentional, but hey, you can do nice things, but especially when it comes to food and you're going through a big hullabaloo for it, make sure they're not allergic. I don't think that was the intended message, but I do like how the reason why it backfired was not because somebody reneged, but because of a simple human thing called an allergy. But that's what I got to say. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 17, Dear Ma. So this is another episode where the storytelling device is one of the characters writing a letter home. In this case, it's Radar writing to his mom, and there's just some great moments, such as when Radar's starting his letter, he says, "I'm writing slowly because you read slowly." That's obviously now how it works, but it's just a great scene. It's a bit humorous, but it also shows that Radar is considerate of the fact that his mother does read at a slower pace than he would write himself. He probably learned that before he started writing his own letters, dictating to his mother, and a little bit of characterization that we can take from that. But of course, that's a minor note. It's just a framing device for the main episode. And there's, I would say, two main plots in this episode. Hawkeye is having to give feet inspections for everyone at the camp, make sure they're healthy, no trench foot or anything like that going on. Meanwhile, Colonel Parto and Margaret are heading off to one of the local villages to, provide aids, medical treatments, that kind of stuff. And Colonel Parto's wife calls, having a premonition that Colonel Parto is about to be shot. And guess who gets shot in the reel? Colonel Parto. And he goes, he doesn't want his wife to know that he got shot, so basically they pretend he's in the officers club rather than in the operating room. So they can still do that. He just has to pretend he's doing surgery. That would be the easiest thing to do. But I said they didn't do it. But honestly, this way was fun though. remember, sometimes when you're doing a comedy, sometimes the humor needs to come before the logic. And honestly, that's how you often get humor, by subverting logic. But there's also everything with Hawkeye inspecting people's feet, including the fact that Frank does not want his feet inspected because he got his toenails painted by Margaret. And honestly, the vibe I'm getting from this scene is more of he's embarrassed because it's not masculine enough. And while, yes, I would say Hawkeye and BJ do kind of reinforce that in Frank's mind, at the same time, they will make fun of Frank probably no matter what. So, yeah. That's at least how I read that scene. There's also a scene where Klinger is writing to President-elect Eisenhower, or was he already president? Again, MASH timelines are always quite not properly lined up. But there is, he basically, I'm crazy. You may see some of the letters I wrote to President Truman showing how crazy I am. Which is just, Klinger's standard stuff and all that. There's some other jokes relating to everything, and all these smaller things, like the Klinger moment, because when Hawkeye is inspecting Klinger, there's a moment where he inspects Father Mulcahy, and there's no joke that it's the feet are original equipment. And also we learned that Father Mulcahy once got bit by his sister, before she became a nun. But in the notes, Hawkeye has radar rated as nun bite, which is just funny. Colonel Potter, he gets a perfect score, which makes sense. He's been in the army since World War I, where trench foot was a pretty big concern, a pretty big thing. So of course he probably would have learned how to avoid that stuff, and then becoming a doctor further learned how to keep his feet clean and healthy. There's some other ones as well, but we don't need to go into all of them. But there's one more thing I do want to talk about this episode. There's a patient that's leaving the camp near the beginning of the episode who sells BJ a watch with no innards as part of a scam. And he ends up back at the 477. So BJ makes a joke. I'm going to have you working as well as that watch. And that proves the soldier gulps. Now, obviously, we don't see what happens, but my opinion is that, BJ did it properly. He's a doctor. There was... if I remember correctly, there was an episode where BJ helps perform a totally non-needed surgery, and it gets at him. I think we got a couple more seasons before we get there. But that just shows that, in my opinion, BJ did do the surgery seriously. He was just doing a little bit of joking to, get back at the soldier for scamming him. But that is what I have to say about Dear Ma. You can let me know your thoughts on this episode in the comment section down below. And I hope to see you next week, where I'll be reviewing the next episode of season 4, The Tag. So I hope to see you then. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBurry555. And today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with season 4, episode 18, The Tag. So, before we actually get into the episode, let's actually address the title, because I always thought this episode's title was The Tag. I don't know why, but it kind of is, but kind of isn't. Let me explain. So, if you know any German, Der is one of the German words for the. German has slightly different grammar structures than English in terms of articles, because they have masculine, feminine, and neuter articles, so that's just something to be aware of. They have grammatical gender, English doesn't. But Der Tag is German for the day. But also, tag, there's a toe tag involved in this episode, so it kind of almost means multiple different things the way you look at it. And honestly, they probably just probably the day part they didn't even think about. They just you know what, let's not say the tag. Nah, Der Tag. Yeah, let's use a German word for the, and just happen to translate into a whole German phrase for the day. That's what I'm guessing happened behind the scenes. I don't know for sure. But let's actually talk about the episode. So, this is episode where Frank is a pretty major character. Margaret's off in Tokyo on a nursing conference, and Frank is getting on everyone's nerves. So, Colonel Potter orders BJ and Hawkeye to make friends with Frank, or at least pretend to. They do. Frank somehow gets extremely lucky at poker, then passes out in the officers club, accidentally hits a jackpot during his passing out. Hawkeye and BJ bring Frank back to the swamp, and there they put a toe tag on him in their drunkenness that reads emotionally exhausted and morally bankrupt. And honestly, doesn't that describe Frank to a T no matter what? And now Frank gets up at one point to go to the train, accidentally falls in an ambulance, and ends up at the battalion aid station. And when the battalion aid station calls the 477 to let them know that Frank showed up randomly, because, they have the 4, which is good because the 477 had no idea where Frank was. And Hawkeye and BJ did not remember putting the toe tag until it was mentioned to them. Again, they were drunk when they did it. So, because the battalion aid station can't send anyone to deliver Frank back to MASH, Hawkeye and BJ have to go retrieve him. I understand for the point of the episode why, but in the actual army, I'm pretty sure they would just send some enlisted to do it. Two of the 4 surgeons that we actually see in the 477. There had to be more surgeons. They had to be. Oh well, it's a TV show after all. So they go there. They do help the battalion aid station. There's a bit with an influx of wounded because they're doctors, of course they are. Then they bring Frank back, put Frank back in his bed. Frank wakes up like nothing happened. He literally did not remember anything that happened after he got drunk, except for them being friends with him and their dumb being his friend. Margaret gets back and the episode ends. That's effectively the episode. And in all honesty, I think this episode they just wanted to almost do a twist on the Frank's character, because while in the past I think there have been episodes before where they are friendly to Frank, that's normally to get something out of Frank. Not necessarily because, actually trying to, make being around him a little easier. That's probably the best way of describing the motivations of the characters involved in this episode. But this is Frank, so yeah, people get angry and frustrated with him pretty easily. And even in him being drunk, it makes him even more unbearable to be around with. Unless you're drunk, I guess. Unless. So, like I said, it's overall a pretty fun episode. There's nothing major going on, but it definitely shows a few other things, because while Margaret is away on the nursing conference in Tokyo, the medical conference, she's hanging out with the nurses and a guy named Frank. No, Fred. Yeah, I think, regardless of whatever that guy's name was. And Frank is jealous. Of course he is jealous. But you can also see the groundwork that's almost being laid in the character for what we know is coming when Margaret gets engaged next time she goes, well, in a future time when she goes to Tokyo, and then Frank's reaction. Not quite the same, but you can kind of see the groundwork being laid. Did they have that in mind when they made this episode? Who knows? Or did they like how they use this dynamic and decide to kind of be inspired by it in the future? Possibly. Can't know for sure. But it's something I definitely picked up on. And given MASH is not known for its continuity, it's safe to say it probably wasn't intentional, at least when this episode was written. But it's still a fun parallel, and definitely shows that even though they didn't care too much about continuity, they were still writing the characters in a sense of at least their characterizations were internally consistent. And as you put them in similar situations, you would get similar results based off of that. I hope I explained my thoughts okay. But that's what I got to say. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 19, Hawkeye. So this episode is a different episode because the only cast member of MASH that we get to see at all is Alan Alda playing Hawkeye. No BJ, no obviously no Trapper, no Frank, no Potter, no Margaret, no Radar. The Radar is mentioned, it's just Hawkeye. And the episode is called, fittingly, Hawkeye. Premise of the episode, Hawkeye is returning from Battalion 8 station, and he swerves to avoid some Korean children playing the road, and his Jeep overturns and he gets a concussion. So this episode is effectively Hawkeye monologuing to stay alert with his concussion, not wanting to fall asleep, while he's waiting for someone to come pick him up and bring him back to the 4077. And that's effectively what's going on. There's also, at the end, after he's picked up, he returns and he gives some presents to the Korean family. So, it's an interesting episode. I know there's a lot of people who don't know how they feel about it, who don't really like this episode. I do get where they're coming from because it is a different episode. And it's literally just Hawkeye monologuing. We do learn a little bit about Hawkeye, about his past, but ultimately, there's nothing new really that we learn about Hawkeye. We don't get some insight into him. Like some of the other times where we learn something new about Hawkeye, like especially in a very Hawkeye focused episode, these are in the later seasons, we actually learn something new about him, and we really don't get that in this episode. And another thing too, Hawkeye does not understand Korean, and the Korean family does not understand English, so there's really no way to play off the characters off of each other. Yes, they could have done something using like body language, sign language even, or something like that. And you can do that, but I feel like they didn't do that in this episode, so that just made on the character interactions I feel a bit hollow, for lack of a better term. Ultimately, I think they just had this weird idea and they wanted to try it out. I don't think it's a bad episode per se, but it's definitely not my favorite. But it's definitely an interesting episode and one that we should continue to discuss because of its differences, because of its the interestingness that comes from those differences. And it's not like surreal like the episode Dreams, which we'll get to in a couple of seasons. But for now, I would like to hear your thoughts on the episode Hawkeye. I guess you can talk about the character Hawkeye as well. Comment section is down below. And I hope to see you next week for the next episode, Some 38th Parallel. So I hope to see you then. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBurry555. And today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 20, Some 38th Parallels. So, I just want to begin that I don't quite understand how this title fits this episode. Because they use some 38th parallels, plural. So I'm thinking, okay, what's going on in the story that are parallels? And there seems to be that a little bit, but it doesn't quite connect for me. So I should probably explain. So there's essentially three main plots going on in this episode. There is a colonel who keeps on getting his men killed by going to rescue men who were killed on the battlefield. Yeah, and so obviously Hawkeye's not happy about that. There's also a plot that with Nurse Abel, Hawkeye's unable to perform, i.e., they're on a date and he's unable to, Yeah, this is actually probably one of the most explicit they've ever gotten about what goes on with Hawkeye's dates with all the nurses. I mean, this is probably one of the most explicit. They still don't say it, but it seems pretty explicit to me. And then there's another plot where, actually, there are two more plots. There's a patient that Radar has taken interest in because he spotted something and that allowed BJ to save the patient's life. Of course, the patient then has a later turn for the worse, and that patient is one of that colonel's men, so it kind of comes all circle. And then Frank decides to sell the camp's garbage to the local Koreans, and Colonel Parr is like, whatever. But anyhow, so this all does eventually come together. The colonel himself arrives wounded, minorly so, and wants his men taken care of, but he doesn't seem to care when that one soldier, the one that Ray are taken interest in, ends up dying. Then there's a point where Hawkeye asks basically BJ, wherever the top bid for this lot of garbage is, $5 more. And Hawkeye gets the garbage, which he then drops on the colonel. And then after that, he's able to go on that date and everything is fine. So, what I think they're trying to say in this episode is by Hawkeye essentially letting go and not being in the driver's seat about this one issue, he's able to apply that to the same thing with his date as well. Maybe. I feel like they weren't necessarily explicit enough in terms of what that connection is, which I can understand why they're doing given what they're implying with how going on with Hawkeye's date and the troubles he's having there. So and this aired on television, they're not going to be super explicit, even though they could be kind of explicit at times in the first 3 seasons. And actually, I do feel like this episode might have been a script that was at one time more considered or written for one of the earlier seasons 1 through 3, where this kind of stuff was a little more common, maybe, it's on the back burner, maybe not even a script, and they find a script out here. I don't know. I've heard rumors that that has happened with some other episodes, so it's not impossible. It's still a fun episode, and honestly, I kind of like the comeuppance that the Colonel gets. It's not going to stop the wounded, unlike some of Hawkeye's other attempts, and there's actually one episode that more explicitly states that, yeah, Hawkeye can stop that one Colonel, but that's not going to stop the wounded coming. But this is more of a Hawkeye being able to be like, this Colonel is driving me nuts, I'm going to pay him out, and does him in a pretty simple way. Disgusting way, mind you. Garbage dropped on you from a helicopter is not that fun, I would imagine. But hey, it gave Hawkeye maybe a sense of control in that situation, which is probably what he ultimately needed in this episode. Also, I love Colonel Porter's response to the trash being dropped. I didn't see it, but I loved it, or something similar. He might have said he liked it or something, but basically he's like, I didn't see anything, but I liked what I saw, even though I didn't see it. Which honestly is why I prefer Colonel Porter as the CEO compared to Henry. Henry was a pushover all the time, but Colonel Porter, he wasn't always a pushover, but he also knew when it's time to look away and not report the behavior of his officers and enlisted. There's actually a scene where Colonel Porter reminds Frank that the enlisted have feelings too, and Frank openly admits that he forgets. Yeah, that happens. Honestly, that was actually quite mature on Frank that he actually admitted to some of his flaws in this episode. Doesn't help him improve as a character, but it is amazingly mature of him. Something I would not normally expect of Frank. But that's ultimately what I have to say about this episode. I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 4, Episode 20, The Novocaine Mutiny. So, in this episode, it's a preliminary court-martial hearing, basically a fact-finding meeting to determine did Hawkeye commit mutiny against Frank when Colonel Porter was away. So, it's basically a courtroom drama. Now, I don't know how military court-martials exactly go. The MASH Wiki does give some advice about what was in the manual from 59, but this was not during 59. And so, if anyone has better knowledge on this stuff, let me know. Actually, I would love to see a legal expert especially one in military law, actually react to this episode and give their thoughts. Now, as long as they remember the historical context, because I saw a medical professional react to a MASH episode and forgot about the historical context. But that's a different matter. It really is a different matter, because what this episode really is showing how bad of a person Frank is. Literally, when Frank is doing his first witness stand opening remarks thing, he literally says that he basically says that basically, unless we all conform, unless we all follow our leaders blindly, we'll never be free. Frank, that's called authoritarianism, and you're not free under it. Yeah. Frank tries to claim Hawkeye is un-American, but he ends up revealing how much of an authoritarian he is, somebody who would end up following a strongman for no other reason than says to follow him, I guess. Frank's not a good person, and we know that. But this episode, beyond that, also shows how he's not fitted for command. He lets power go to his head. Literally, Colonel Porter, before he leaves, tells Frank, don't go over the top with discipline. I'm only going to be gone for 6 days. What's one of the first things Frank does when they're gone? Outlaws, or bans, I should say, gambling. Which is what a lot of the camp does to pass time. Zero loses $300 gambling. Axon tells Frank that he lost $300, but so he doesn't get in trouble for gambling, he says he just lost it. It's gone. 1 minute's wallet, next minute, poof, gone. Frank then assumes the money has been stolen and goes on a hunt. BJ and Hawkeye tell Frank it was lost gambling. And you know what Frank does? He doesn't get mad because of gambling. He's like, no, I banned gambling, therefore it cannot have been lost gambling. Frank, they literally told you the truth and you don't believe it because you don't believe that people would go against your orders. You always think Hawkeye's out to get you, and always, yeah. Really shows Frank's character, and then it turns out Radar knew where the money was the entire time because he had won it gambling, and he had put in his teddy bear. And then Frank, in the court martial room, basically says that he should have ripped the stuffing out of him. Radar, not Radar's teddy bear. I think Frank should be charged with conduct unbecoming an officer. I'm just saying. And then, of course, we hear Frank's own recap of the mutiny. Basically, he's portraying himself being the only competent person, everyone's failing, blah, blah, blah. And then he's stabbed with something by Hawkeye. Then Hawkeye goes to the stand and gets his version of events, which starts off saying that Frank's story is fascinating but untrue, but no doubt Frank remembers it that way. Which is actually probably the case, given how we know Frank likes to think of himself very highly, of course. And then Hawkeye's narrative is that Frank is doing a bad job at pre-op, and during their argument, so Hawkeye does admit that him and Frank did argue. Frank walked into the door and was knocked unconscious, which honestly is probably what really happened. And also, the coroner who's basically conducting this hearing says that he not just served testimony as boss of the records, and I wouldn't be surprised if written statements from the other people who was there, because the Coleman, the nurses who was there, all should have been put on the stand as well. For time reasons, why I can see why they didn't, but they should have been, and hopefully at least their written statements were taken, especially since this story is presented as a preliminary hearing. And then, of course, we get to hear that Hawkeye has a good record, and so they decide to trust him over Frank's record, where in the coroner's judgment, Frank would have been a pastry chef if he wasn't a doctor. So yeah, that tells you something. That's essentially where the episode ends. Hawkeye is gotten off once again because of mostly his medical skills, but also because his story is the truthful story as the narrative presents it. And then we get to see a ending scene where it's another gambling game. Frank complains to Colonel Potter. Colonel Potter's like, deal me in. Because Frank apparently had never rescinded his ban. Everyone assumed the minute Colonel Potter got back, the ban was lifted. Colonel Potter's gambled with them before. Of course he's going to lift it. And Colonel Potter, unlike Frank, does not let his authority get to his head. Yes, he knows when to use it, but he also knows when it's okay to let people break loose a little bit, especially if it's for morale purposes. So yeah, overall, it's a good, fun episode. It really shows how terrible of a person that Frank is. Not like we need to know that, but it's also just a fun episode. There's some just good, humorous moments. There is one moment where when Frank was searching, he goes into Corporal Klinger's tent, and he, goes through Klinger's, underwear, but he doesn't go through Father McKay's Carlos, which Radar calls him out on. And there's probably some other small moments I can't talk about, but there's one other moment I do want to share before I finish my review. And that's with Frank being, almost to regulation. There's one thing he does correct. Rightfully point out uncleanliness in the kitchen. I will give Frank credit for that. You do not want an unclean kitchen because that can cause food poisoning, that can cause illness. So he is right in that regard. Well, that's one place where, yeah, discipline should not be slacking, but letting people gamble, yeah, he should allow that, and some other things as well. But ultimately, that's the one thing I'll give Frank credit for, because food safety is not something you should take lightly. But there's another interesting part of this episode. Margaret does not appear at all. Because if she had appeared, that could have been a really interesting character dynamic where her sense of professional responsibility is in conflict with her, basically, loyalty, for lack of a better term, her friendship, her romantic interest with Frank. It could have been a very interesting character conflict to see. Now, it sounds like there was scheduling conflicts that prevented Margaret from appearing because Loretta Swift was not able to appear for several of these final production episodes. And also, at least in universe, you can argue for that the hearing itself was someone who was responsible had to stay behind at the camp. And who would that be? Margaret. Actually, I made this comment on on the MASH Reddit subreddit recently where I forget everything about it, but essentially I made like, yeah, we all know Margaret is the one who should really be the second in command because she actually knows what she's doing, something along those lines. But ultimately, though, despite her not being there, and it would have been good, I think, to have her in here, the episode did not suffer because of it. It's not like they had to. It's clear they wrote this episode knowing she was not going to be able to be there. Therefore, she doesn't feel missing from this episode. Her presence, I think, would have been nice, but it's not like they had to rewrite her role for another character and it suffers. So I'll give them credit on that. There was her not being there did not hurt the episode, which does sometimes happen when you remove a key character from a show. It can happen. This case it doesn't, and I'm going to give that as a credit to the writers who figured out how to write this episode without her and decided to have a different source of drama than a character conflict for Margaret rather than interpersonal conflict between Hawkeye and Frank, which I think in the context of this episode was definitely the right thing to do. But that's what I got to say. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH Retro Reviews with Season 4, Episode 22, Smilin Jack. So this episode, the main plot is about a chopper pilot who has diabetes but wants to bring the most number of wounded in within the year. Granted, we have no idea when this episode is set because this episode gives contradicting information. By the way, you do not watch MASH for historical timeline accuracy. The fact that they get it mostly period accurate is quite impressive for a TV show made in the 70s. But ignoring that, essentially what this episode is really about is basically a fairly charismatic chopper pilot who has taken home basically the second, at this point in the timeline, the second most amount of wounded, taking them from the front to MASH units. There's one other who's got like one or two on him, and he wants to ensure the victory. So he defies orders to be grounded because they did him thorough medical checkup and found out that he has diabetes and he can't fly with that. He defies orders and decides to bring bring to MASH 477 4 patients. And the chopper that they use can only handle 3 people, two wounded, and the chopper pilot. So yeah. Now I will say I think we have seen an episode before where they put forward the MASH wiki does make a note that that last fight would have been basically impossible. It would have been just not possible. But I gotta say, the episode also implies that it should not have been possible. So maybe some plot intervention, if you will. And it turns out that the other pilot brings in another wounded and takes back the #1 spot. Almost kind of like showing that the war will always continue. And actually, the ending scene reaffirms that. Colonel Potter is regaling the doctors and nurses during an oral session of some of his tales from World War One, including about a fighter pilot who dropped hand grenades on the German trenches, which, by the way, is something that pilots actually did during World War One. And then Hawkeye asks Colonel Potter which war of the 3 that he was in, World War One, World War Two, and Korea, which one was the worst. And then the PA makes an announcement about a British regiment, one of their battalions, losing 500 out of its 600-man complement in battle. I forget the exact number, but it was the Gloucester Regiment. And that actually happened. They actually lost over 600 people during a delaying action much earlier in the war than when this episode is supposedly set by itself for another thing that tries to set the timeline. And then Colonel Potter responds, each and every one, Hawkeye, each and every one. And I think what that shows with basically almost with Smilin Jack's, not his character arc, but his plot arc, shows that, war never changes. And it's all the same. There's never a good war. Now, sometimes a war may be fought for a more just cause, but it still doesn't make war itself any good. And they're certainly not commenting on the morality at all of the causes, just war itself. And that's true. War itself is always a bad thing. If you can avoid war, do so. it's better for nearly everyone involved except for the defense contractor. But there's also another smaller plot with this episode, and one of the wounded that Smilin Jack brings in is a fairly young soldier this is his second time being wounded and second time being sent into the front. So obviously he has, I would say, some anxiety, some fear. BJ begins the process of talking with him, but Smilin Jack put his stunt and has Radar stay with the patient. And honestly, Radar's conversation, I think, did more to help this wounded soldier because, like, both of them are corporals, but both of them have probably the same, they do have the same fears, uncertainties. And I think that is what helped resolve that character's arc. It's a small arc, but it's a nice arc, and also shows that sometimes, yeah, maybe the doctors are good in the job, but sometimes you just need someone who's in the same place as you and who can properly empathize with you, and that can make you feel all better knowing that you're not alone in your feelings. That alone can do a lot. And that's something that BJ would not have been able to offer the soldier, but something that Radar was able to. It's just a neat little thing that even though Radar himself had never been to the front, he is in a position and is portrayed to be in the same kind of, age group. So it works better for how they want to portray the story. I think I phrased that the way I wanted to. Obviously, sometimes it's kind of hard to phrase everything about everything because there's so many different ways you can discuss things, and that's what these reviews are about, discussing these episodes of MASH. And let's continue that discussion. I have a comment section down below. Feel free to share whatever you would like about the episode. Let's keep this discussion going. And I'll see you next week for episode 23, and we're getting near the end of season 4. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with season 4, episode 23, The More I See You. And this episode actually provides some insightful backstory into Hawkeye. Kind of explains a little bit of his womanizing behavior that we see earlier in the season. We still see it a bit later on in the series, but it's more portrayed more as dating around. Basically, when Hawkeye was in residency, he was seeing someone and was pretty serious. And she ends up returning in this episode because she happens to be transferred to the 477. And they were not serious, but not serious, because they were living together, but not technically married. Now, when this episode is set, and when that would have occurred in historical timeline, would have been a huge social taboo. But when the episode was made, not as much, and definitely they portrayed it in the episode more like how it would have been when the show was made. I.e., like, okay, people are doing that. Now, if Frank had been in this episode, you bet they probably would just have Frank be totally judging Hawkeye for it. And then Hawkeye will probably retort about how Frank is, cheating on his wife. I'm just saying, that's probably how that would have gone. Don't know why they didn't show Frank in there, except for either Larry Linville wasn't available for this episode, or they decided that for this episode, having that conflict between Hawkeye and Frank in some form would not have worked for the episode, and I think that is actually the right call. But yeah, so an old flame of Hawkeyes, they broke up, and as we learned throughout the episodes, because he was giving too much attention to his medical work and not enough attention to her, i.e. he couldn't commit to two things at the same time and was prioritizing one at the expense of the other. And then afterwards, she eventually found someone else and got married, and still kept on being nurse, but ended up at the 477, and all the feelings on both of their ends returns. And that actually leads to her starting an affair, or Hawkeye starting an affair with her. We can score it either way. The emotions come back, and let's just say this is probably the episode that I would say doesn't paint Hawkeye in the best light, because it portrays him as almost insecure about stuff, and more of his snappier side to a person who a person who doesn't deserve it. When he's snappy with Frank, or with a officer who's throwing their men into the field of battle willy-nilly, Hawkeye's snappiness is portrayed as justified, but here it's portrayed as, I don't know if this is a good way of, I don't know if they necessarily portray it as wrong, but unfounded is probably a good way of phrasing in how they present it in the episode. And ultimately the nurse, her name is Carly, by the way, decides to request a transfer because she can't stay there with Hawkeye. And that is actually, in the way that it's presented in the episode, probably for the best. She can't work with Hawkeye and stay faithful in her marriage, even if she, with all the feelings coming back and starting to feel unsatisfied in her marriage, she still can't do that. Meanwhile, Hawkeye traps himself in the corner. Literally, he actually does that in when he's like, maybe I'll actually be able to commit this time. But, like, the way he's phrasing it is like, he thinks he might be able to, but it's not a guarantee. And that contributes to the relationship, ending again. But this time, it's portrayed that it's ended much healthier, where they actually talk about why the relationship is not working, which didn't happen the first time. So allows maybe some growth. Is there any consequence of this growth in MASH? No, but it does allow for it. And if MASH was made nowadays, yeah, well, minus the show like MASH wouldn't be made today because it will only get 10 episodes a season. It would be canceled after 2 seasons on streaming because it wouldn't made enough money or have a large enough audience. And then maybe it would have bounced to another streaming service, but probably not. I have whole thoughts on the current streaming ecosystem. But the point I just really wanted to convey there is, yeah, there's going to be no further consequences for this episode. But this episode does explain Hawkeye's behavior in the past, which makes it quite unique. This episode also introduces Colonel Porter's hobby of painting. He paints a picture of Radar and a picture of Klinger. And I do know we see the Klinger portrait several times in later episodes. I don't remember the Radar portrait. I'll try to point it out if I see it again, but I'll probably forget. That's more of a side tangent, a side note from the rest of the episode. But there's one last thing too. A conversation between Hawkeye and BJ. And BJ states that he doesn't cheat on his wife Peg, not because cheating would get him sent to hell without an electric fan, not because cheating is wrong, but simply because he doesn't want to do it. And I think that also portrays a lot of difference between not just Hawkeye and BJ in terms of things like Hawkeye doesn't mind, affairs and that. But it also paints a contrast between BJ and Trapper who is notoriously unfaithful to his wife. Well, BJ is notoriously faithful. And in fact, there's actually a later episode where BJ is tempted and he feels notoriously guilty about it. We'll talk about that episode when we get to it. But the point is to show that contrast, not just with former MASH, but also with present MASH, how basically BJ takes his responsibilities in his marriage seriously, while Hawkeye does not take responsibility in his relationships. This is one of the first times where that even occurs with Hawkeye in his relationships. I remember an episode in, I think it was season 3, where there was a rumor that the war was over and they were all getting shipped home. Well, Hawkeye, because he was seeing multiple nurses, tells lies to all of them to get out of any long-term commitment with them once the war is over. And that kind of continues here. Like, he doesn't really want to. He can't properly commit to anything, and thus, for him, not committing is just a thing that he does. Just as with BJ, him not wanting to cheat is just something he wants to do. It's a contrast between the characters. Is there more we can discuss in this episode? Probably. In fact, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below, and I'll see you next week for episode 24. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH reviews with Season 4, Episode 24, Deluge. So, this episode is, probably one of the most interesting from a timeline-wise, as in previous episodes, it's implied that MASH is now set in the later war, but here, China just got involved, which was earlier in the war. Again, timeline continuity thing with MASH is not really a thing, but what this episode really does interesting is it splices archival newsreel / propaganda footage with the actual episode. Now, on the MASH wiki, they claim that Larry Gilbert claimed that they did that because they ran out of footage when they were editing, i.e. they did not shoot enough and it was too late to shoot more, so they spliced newsreel footage into the episode. I do wonder, you wrote an episode and you did not realize you were not going to have enough recorded footage from it? Trying too much to portray this as a happy accident, I think? And it's also possible that they may have planned some newsreel footage, but not all of it, which that is a distinct possibility as well. And that could be where they lost the time. Like, oh, we saw we had more newsreel footage than we actually need, or something like that. So maybe, sure. But regardless of whether it was intentional or not, it definitely makes this episode unique and helps it stand out. And also helps gives us the audience a break from the constant they're dealing with a deluge of patients, hence the name. And that's where the Chinese entering the war comes in, because the UN lines are overrun, so there's going to be an influx of casualties. And that's ultimately what this episode is. They're running low on plasma because they got a bunch of expired. They run out of surgical gloves, so they have to sanitize their hands with alcohol before every single patient because they have no more gloves, so they have to operate barehanded, which is not great from a sanitary perspective. They also have to deal with a fire outside of OR because you got a bunch of rags now soaked with alcohol and somebody carelessly throws a cigarette into the laundry. Of course, the same soldier that Hawkeye earlier asked, don't smoke in there because they got a bunch of, flammable substances around. And that was before they ran out of surgical gloves. So yeah, and there's also, it's raining, so that's not helping their lighting situation because apparently they are running with light bulbs that if you get wet, they explode. Let's not also forget there was a scene where BJ got a face full of blood because it squirted at him. And let's not also forget, too, that their mines are going off because of a change in the weather, because apparently there's a minefield near the 4077, which has been a constant thing. I don't know if that's actually good historical practice or not. Not good historical. If it was, we don't need to apply moral judgment right now. It's just, was it historical practice or not? I have no idea whatsoever. But effectively, this episode is just basically one thing after another for the characters to deal with. And thus, the newsreel footages gives us, the audience, a chance to take a breath. Now, they actually were able to kind of connect some of the newsreels to the events going on, including a ping pong playing cat named Deadwood, something along that line, which apparently BJ somehow references that. Again, I don't know how they actually did that, if it wasn't intentional, but apparently it was unintentional, according to the claims. Who knows? But overall, this is actually a really fun episode, despite the deluge, because it's not just good character moments, such as this scene where Margaret demands that, hey, don't send us nurses away, I was born to serve, etc., to Colonel Potter. Like, that really shows a lot about Margaret's character and how she is probably the most military zero besides Colonel Potter when you really think about it. She mentioned that she was born in an army house, but she didn't know what a civilian was for a while, which also explains a lot about Margaret's behavior as well. Considering, the way she very much definitely likes chains of command and more authoritative leadership style, for lack of a better term. Again, explains actually a lot about her. But there's also, too, some pretty good scenes here and there. I can't talk about every single one of them because to do that, it just would take way too long. But one scene that stuck out to me is partially because of another YouTube channel I've been recently watching a lot of videos from. If you ever heard of the YouTube channel World War Wisdom, it's a channel by a World War II reenactor who, from what I can tell, really knows his stuff. And he recently, 7 months ago or so, did an episode about white phosphorus. And in this episode, one of the patients that the 477 is treating has white phosphorus burns on his legs. And just having watched that video only a couple of days ago, it's like, Actually, I think I watched it yesterday as of the recording of this episode. I'm recording this in advance, by the way. But it made me like, yeah, they really do have to take white phosphorus pretty seriously. Because when this episode aired, I wasn't that old. I'm not that old. When I originally watched this episode, I had no idea what white phosphorus was. None. But now I do. And yeah, it was pretty much the only chemical that was used in World War II on the front lines. But yeah, just having that additional historical context, and it's quite impressive that I just recently watched that video not too long ago, and gives me a bit more context of how serious white phosphorus is. Now, I think in the episode they did a good job explaining, the dangers of white phosphorus. But having that additional context was, in my opinion, really helped me to understand the gravity of that scene a little bit more. And yeah, there is certainly a lot more I can talk about, but let's keep the discussion going. Let me know your thoughts on this episode. Any kind of small moments that you like that I didn't end up talking about, let me know all that stuff in the comment section down below. And I'll see you next week for the final episode of Season 4. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with the 25th and final episode of Season 4, The Interview. So this episode is a change of pace, a change of format. Actual World War II war correspondent Cleet Roberts plays himself interviewing the cast members of MASH, but in their characters. And from what's been revealed behind the scenes, some of the questions were spontaneous, so i.e. they were not in the script. Cleet Roberts just asked them, and either the actors came up with the answers before filming, or sometimes even on the spot while being filmed. Some of them, of course, were scripted. It's a mix of both, which I think really helps convey the authenticness of this episode, because it really does feel like you're watching actual interviews of actual people. And it also really shows how good many of these actors are. Like, literally, the different ways each actor responds to some of the same questions is fascinating. Not every question I feel like we get an answer from every single actor, but we do for a lot of them. For example, one of them is asking the question, this is actually near the end, but do you have anyone at home you would like to say hi? Klingo says hi to everyone, his family, his friends, his wife, everyone. Radar says hi to his mother and his uncle Ed. Once the individual is like, yeah, they'll make the trip to go see it because apparently Radar's family doesn't have a television in their home, but there is one like next town over. Father McKay just does a simple hello. BJ does a heartfelt hello to his wife and daughter. Hawkeye does a sarcastic hello to President Truman. And also, they actually bleep a swear when he does that too. Because he reveals that he wrote a letter to Best Truman, and he's insulted that he was at least called a son of a bee by President Truman. And Colonel Potter declines to say hello to him because he doesn't think it's dignified to do so. All those things show some slightly different characterizations of the characters and really does insight. Oh, and I forgot. And Frank says basically he dismisses it. He also doesn't say hello to anyone, but he kind of says everyone knows how they feel about me already. Man, I think Frank has some low self-esteem and at the same time very high self-confidence of his own self-esteem, even though it's actually low. Does that make any sense? Because it didn't to me. There's also another question where Robert asks about the nurses. Colonel Potter, Hawkeye, BJ, Klinger all praises the nurses and gives them credit. I forget which one of them, but one of them even states that they should get more credit. Meanwhile, Frank, competent, just competent. No praise, no that, just like, yep, they do their job. Which kind of made, and honestly, basically he's like, yep, they do their job. I'm not going to give them any more credit than that. And that does actually very much fit Frank's character. And there's just some other great moments here and there. I won't go through them all because if there's any episode, if you only watch one episode of MASH, I would say this especially would be one of the top ones to consider. So I don't want to talk about all of it. We can talk more about this episode in the comment section, and I will talk about everything in there, but I don't want to talk about it all because this episode, if I talked about everything, one, I wouldn't capture it as well I think as the episode actually does, but two, this is an episode where I think it's actually really good not to know every single piece, every single question that's asked and how the different characters respond. But they all do respond in character, and all very much fit the character. I've already stated that, but I do want to reiterate that. And the ones I decided to share are the ones I think best illustrate what I'm trying to explain here. And one last thing I do want to discuss too. This episode has no color. It's all in black and white with the exception of the title and closing sequence. And this episode actually opens with probably a producer stating that this episode is in black and white. Likely because back then wanted to make sure people didn't think there was something wrong with their television. And you know something else too? Just hearing that made me think of, because I've watched a lot of classic television, including stuff that was from both in black and white and in color. But also too, I have watched a show that only the pilot episodes in color, and every single episode, only the pilot episodes in black and white, but the rest of the show is in color. That show being Hogan's Heroes, and that always opens up. CBS presents this program in color, and it's just like seeing those remnants of that time. Now, probably back then too, it was like, hey guys, buy color television. And here it's like, hey guys, we're doing this in black and white on purpose. You guys need nothing to worry about. And it's kind of that different contrast between how a show produced a little bit earlier when color TV was just starting to get probably more popular and not everyone would have had the set, versus now, yeah, everyone probably does have a color television set. Some people probably don't, but there's some people, when the TV goes black and white, they're probably worried they failed, so we gotta remind them it's not in color, it's actually in black and white. And I just thought that was an interesting. Now, am I right about half my speculation though? I don't know. But I do think it fits, and definitely to me portrays a different vibe in why they're stating that. Here it's like, hey guys, we're making an artistic choice, not, hey guys, buy a color television set so you can actually see the color. Different connotations in how those things are presented. Especially because in this episode, it's not paired with a network bumper. It's just probably one of the producers saying it. Larry Gilbert, for all we know, which by the way, this is apparently his last episode as both a writer and director on the show, as he wouldn't return in season 5. Just one last thing I wanted to show before I ended this video and opened up the comment section, which of course was open from the very first second of this video. And I'll see you next week where I review all of season 4 of MASH. So stay tuned for that. So now that we've taken a look at each individual episode, let's talk about season 4 as a whole of MASH. Many people have different thoughts on MASH. Some people prefer the later seasons, but I would say season 4 and probably by extension season 5 from what I remember are probably some of the most consistent episodes as a whole. The quality is pretty good. You got some great character moments, some great jokes. I feel like there was one episode which I should have jotted down in season 4 that I did not like, but most of these episodes are really good. I would say not all of them are standout. I feel like some of the best standout episodes are later in MASH, but we got some standout ones here. The interview, which is the one most recent in my head, probably part of the reason why I'm thinking of it, is a great standout episode. I really love that change of format. I think that served as a really great season finale. Deluge as a whole too also stood out because of that intersplicing of newsreel footage, and with the episode as a whole just really felt like that was also a good, not only penultimate episode, but they didn't do the interview, which I think made a satisfying end of the season, as that episode ends with basically, I forgot to mention in my review, but with the 477 being given an award for their service during basically that deluge, which is, I think, kind of fitting. And you can also talk about Welcome Korea and Change of Commander, great standout episodes as well. Notice some of my favorite episodes I mentioned off the top of my head are the first two and the last two. And honestly, those are probably some of the episodes you generally want to be the best, because people are going to make sure that you tune in for the first one and probably the second one as well. Maybe even the third one, especially if the first one is actually a two-parter. So yeah, you want that one to stand out and be pretty good, but also you want to end on a high note, and I think they did that for season 4. And season 4 as a whole is some pretty good quality episodes. There was another episode recently, the Novocaine Mutiny is another one of my favorite episodes of season 4. And I know I'm missing a lot more. So season 4 I would describe it as the consistent MASH. They did not really do too much experimentation like they would in the later seasons, especially with the episode Dreams, which we'll get to season 8 if I remember correctly. And you also don't have to worry about burnout yet. They also did a very great job handling replacing two major characters and two actors on the show. Many shows have done it different ways. And for example, Hogan's Heroes, when they replaced Kinchlow, so played by Avon Dixon, with Washington, played by I forget who, even though I looked this up like a week ago as of recording. Regardless, they just switched and didn't address it at all. And it kind of, I think, suffered for the show because the new character, or was it he played by Kenneth Washington? I'm probably getting those names mixed up. But that changeover wasn't as well handled. They just did it and no dressing, no nothing at all. Then you got at least it changed the character rather than doing the same actor once again. Rather than changing the actor but saying the character is the same. But some shows have done that. For example, the show Bewitched, they replaced who played Samantha's husband. And yes, they found an actor who looked very similar, but you could definitely tell the slight difference. But again, there's no addressing all of that. Nothing whatsoever. Meanwhile, what do they do in MASH? Henry gets sent home and is killed over the Sea of Japan. They get a new colonel who is different, but he's not the hardline military, even though that's what they thought they were getting based off of what the orders said. And meanwhile, Trapper just up and left. They at least do address his leaving and introduce BJ as his replacement, and they made BJ a different character from Trapper. Both BJ and Potter are different than Trapper and Henry. And I think that serves it well. There's two ways really of replacing characters, and I read three ways actually. But MASH is probably my favorite way of doing it. If you're going to replace an actor and you also decide you're going to replace the character, do something with that change. Don't do the Hogan series where you replace the character and the actor and never address it. At least say like, no, got transferred. That's all you need to say, got sent home. Well, when we work in Hogan heroes. But the point being is, have that plausible reasoning for why that character changed. Especially in a military show, all you need to do is claim transfer in some way and you've justified it. Not every show can do that. Like, I dream of like Bewitched. Yeah, that show wouldn't have really worked to say a transfer. Magical Accident, though, is definitely something they could have done. In fact, in Sabrina the Teenage Witch, they use magic to justify why certain actors decided not to either continue or for some reason the writers decided to write out. They used magic as the excuse. And sometimes it's just, yep, the family up and moved and left. They actually did that once as well. But the point being is, if you have something baked into your setting like magic or a transfer to justify changing character, replacing an actor, whether you keep the character the same or not, take it. Do that, because that helps enrich the setting rather than just doing it and never addressing it. And what MASH really has shown, that is, having a way to address it. They actually go beyond than just saying a simple transfer. They actually not just do a simple, okay, the character got sent home, the character got transferred. But they also decide to write the characters to be new characters. Not every show does that. And also, eventually I know there's an episode later on in MASH where BJ being a different character from Trapper is ultimately part of the plot, which is even more amazing because not every show does that, especially a show like MASH, which kind of ignores its own continuity a lot of the time. Now, what else can I talk about Season 4 of MASH? Not too much, because I want to open up the discussion. There's a comment section down below. Feel free to leave your thoughts about any one episode about Season 4 as a whole, or even any part of MASH as well. I'll be taking a break next week before we move on to Season 5, but Season 5, well, we're going to begin with Episode 1, which, if I remember correctly, is the episode Bug Out, another standout episode, but we gotta wait for that, so I hope to see you then. Thank you for watching my video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give this video a like and share. Also, consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on all my latest content. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and as always, have a good day, a good night, wherever you are. May the force be with you, always.